Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Kenyon College's 200 Years of Learning in the Company of Friends virtual lecture series. My name is Colette Cosgrove, and I serve as the Advancement Fellow in our Alumni office. I'm delighted to continue our virtual lecture series tonight with Judy Holdener, who will highlight recent alumni work who have done in the mathematical field, spanning from theoretical mathematics, applied mathematics, and statistics. Before we get started, as I've asked before, I ask that if you feel comfortable, please add the year you graduated into your Zoom name. I also ask that if anyone does have any questions throughout this virtual lecture series, to please hold all questions until the end. But in the meantime, I will turn things over to Judy to get things started.
Okay. Let me see if I can get my slides up. Thank you, Colette. Let's see. Can everybody see this? Good. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Colette. I'm honored to have been invited to give this bicentennial lecture. And I appreciate this opportunity to celebrate 200 years of mathematics at Kenyon. We have an ambitious program planned tonight, but I hope that tonight's event will give us all a chance to reflect on where we are and how the work we do and the work others do impact those around us and those who come after us. I, for one, I feel very fortunate to work with a group of incredibly smart and hardworking faculty. We are currently a department of 12, 5 women, 7 men with expertise spanning statistics, logic, algebra, analysis, applied mathematics, and computer science. I want to recognize Professor Carol Schumacher, who will be entering phased retirement at the end of this year. And I know that many of you on this call have benefited greatly from her teaching and her advice over the years. She has made history at Kenyon as the first woman in mathematics to receive tenure. To give you a brief overview of tonight's program, I'm going to start out by talking quickly about the history of mathematics over primarily the first 100 years. We have time constraints, but also this is a time period I think that's most mysterious for most of us. It certainly was for me before I started preparing for this presentation. Afterwards, the 3 alumni will then speak about the work that they're currently doing in their own mathematical careers. And I've chosen these 3 alumni, not just because they are awesome, and they are awesome, but also because they represent the 3 different tracks within the mathematics major. Because we have 4 speakers and we're limited on time, I'm going to ask that we hold all of our questions until the end after everyone has presented. And then at the end of the session, there'll be breakout sessions. So participants will be able to connect with individual speakers. So as I said before, we currently have 12 faculty in our department, but in 1830, there was just one mathematics professor. I don't know much about him, but I did notice that there was a graduate with exactly the same name among Kenyon's first graduating class in 1829, and prior to 1830, there weren't any math professors. So I think it's safe to conclude that George Dennison graduated with a bachelor's degree at Kenyon and began attending faculty meetings. Also, notice there are only 6 faculty in total, counting the librarian, and the chemistry teacher, T.H. Mitchell, had an MD and also served as Kenyon's physician. Of course, the college was able to get away with just 6 faculty in those early years because the enrollments were very small and because every student took the exact same lineup of courses in all 4 years at the college. I'm showing you the 1833 course of study because this particular Xerox copy was of better quality than the others. But what you see here will give you a good sense of what the course of study looked like during the first couple decades of the college's history. All students took courses in algebra and geometry during their sophomore year. All students took courses in trigonometry, mensuration, surveying, navigation, and conic section, spherical trigonometry, and geometry in their junior year. Right? Notice that there was no calculus whatsoever taught, right? But that didn't last for long. In 1855, algebra was moved to the freshman year, and courses in differential calculus and integral calculus were added to the sophomore and junior years. So in 1855, all Kenyon students were taking mathematics courses during 3 of their 4 years at the college. Departments of instruction appear for the first time in the 1867-68 catalog, with 10 different departments listed, including mathematics. But there's still a fixed course of study for all students, and there are only 5 full-time faculty members covering the 10 departments. And if you look closely at the listing on the right, you'll see that the college was unable to fill the McIlvaine Professor of English Literature and History in 1867. And as the footnote explains, the duty of this professorship was performed by the other professors during this vacancy. So faculty wore many hats at this time. You might also notice that professors at this time had Masters of Arts degrees only. And this isn't surprising given that the first PhD in mathematics was granted by, or first PhD in mathematics granted at an American institution was awarded in 1862, and this was at Yale. So in those days, there just weren't many scholars with PhDs available for hire. Theodore Sterling, listed here, well, let me go back. Listed here in this list of faculty, he had the title of Peabody Professor of Mathematics and Civil Engineering. He held both a master's degree and an MD, and he turned out to be a very interesting person in the college's history, so I want to say a few words about him. So he earned his medical degree in 1851 at Western Reserve in Cleveland, which is now Case Western Reserve, and then started a private practice in the Cleveland area before deciding his passion was teaching science. He then became a high school science teacher, and he did that for about a decade before the college hired him at the age of 40 to teach mathematics. He ended up spending the next 45 years at Kenyon, serving in many different capacities, teaching not only mathematics, but chemistry, philosophy, civil engineering, botany, physiology, and political science. But his influence extended well beyond the classroom because in 1891, after 24 years at the college, Sterling took the helm as Kenyon's 11th president. And this would explain why there's his tombstone is so prominent in Kenyon Cemetery. It's funny because I've noticed this tombstone over the years while walking my dog, and I've wondered about it because unlike other tombstones, there are no dates on it. It's pristine. Its condition is sterling, right? Now I know that Sterling was a former mathematics professor and a former professor at the college. He died in 1912 at the age of 85 in his home, which was located where Gun Commons currently stands. He served as president for about 5 years, from 1891 to 1896, which was apparently a difficult period in Kenyon's history because of the low enrollments. So according to the college's website, he resigned after recognizing that his approach to increase enrollments by admitting students who were less qualified was not so good for the long-term health of the institution. He returned to the mathematics department in 1896 and later served for a short while as the dean of faculty. In the late 1890s, students began having some choice in their course of study. Freshmen and sophomores were still required to take some fixed take the same fixed set of courses, but students began having options during their junior and senior years, leading up to one of 3 possible degrees: Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of Philosophy, or Bachelor of Science. So for example, if you were doing the Bachelor of Philosophy instead of the Bachelor of Arts, instead of taking both Latin and Greek, you would maybe be able to take a course in German or French to replace Greek. And students pursuing the Bachelor of Science degree, they were required to take math classes throughout their junior year, but the other 2 tracks, students could then opt to not take mathematics. Also notice that during this time, the mathematics department was merged with the astronomy department. And the Department of Mathematics and Astronomy was housed in Ascension Hall, which also housed the college's observatory at the top of its central tower. I've never been in this astronomy tower, but it was used for observation and experiments for nearly 90 years, from 1860 to 1950. And the department offered surveying courses through the mathematics department, right, during this time frame. By the turn of the 19th century, a PhD in mathematics wasn't such a rare thing, and the college began hiring mathematicians with PhDs. The first several PhD hires stayed for just a couple years, but the college hit the jackpot when they hired this man, Reginald B. Allen, a name many of you will recognize because our department now awards the Allen Prize to students with exceptional promise in mathematics. And I know that some of the people on this call have won this award, including all 3 of the alumni presenters here tonight. A devoted and beloved professor, Allen served as the head of the mathematics department for 32 years until his unexpected death at the age of 66 due to a heart attack. According to an article I found in the Collegian, the students affectionately called Professor Allen Gummy, for 3 decades because of his habit of wearing gum rubber shoes in all types of weather. And I imagine they were referring to galoshes here, which Alan probably needed to protect his shoes from middle path. Alan was also very good friends with William Foster Pierce, who was the president of the college at the time, and a very effective one at that. Pierce expanded the college tremendously during his leadership, increasing the enrollments and expanding the curriculum, and Alan was an influential part of the process. In fact, Alan essentially led the college during the First World War, while Pierce was with the American forces in France. As the college hired more professors with PhDs, the number of upper-level course offerings increased, and it took me a while to track this down, but I finally was able to determine that students began choosing discipline-specific majors in the academic year 1927-28. So it's like midway through Kenyon's history, right? About 100 years ago. The disciplinary focus happened largely during the students' junior and senior years, and the college continued to grant 3 different bachelor's degrees in arts, philosophy, and science. Like today, students were supposed to declare their major during the spring of their sophomore year. Mathematical course offerings also started to look like what we are familiar with today, including differential equations, modern geometry, vector analysis, and statistical mathematics, which was offered for the very first time in 1927. So we are approaching the centennial for the teaching of statistics at Kenyon, and we'll have another reason to celebrate in just a few years. By 1933, the department also added courses in advanced differential equations, point sets, probability, modern algebra, and theory of functions. By the end of Professor Allen's tenure, the staples of classical math majors as a mathematical math major, as we understand it today, they were in place. The majors data that I was able to get from Kenyon's Office of Institutional Research only dates back to about 1950. So we're missing the first couple decades here, but this graph demonstrates the growth of the math major at Kenyon over the past century. In the early years, there was just one track, the classical math track. But in 1980, a computer science track was added. It ran until 1995, when the department found itself stretched too thin after creating the statistics track, which occurred in 1994. And so it discontinued the computer science track in 95. Statistics has flourished since that time under the hard work and leadership of Professors Hartlaub, Jones, and Leatherman. In 2019-20, the department added a new applied math track, which has been very popular of late. And this year we hired applied mathematician Mirsa G in a new tenure track line to help lead this. I want to say a few words about Otto Nikodym, because he's Kenyon's most famous mathematics professor, known for his contribution to the development of the Lebesgue-Radon-Nikodym integral and the well-known Radon-Nikodym theorem. Nikodym was a Polish mathematician who began teaching at Kenyon in 1949 after meeting William Transue at a mathematical conference in London in 1948. Transue was the head of Kenyon's math department at the time, and like many intellectuals living in Europe during the 1940s, Otto and his Polish wife, Stanislawa, who was also a mathematician and Jewish, wanted to escape Europe because of the politics. So after Transue spoke with Nikodym, he contacted the president of Kenyon at that time, who was Gordon Chalmers, and they were able to broker a deal. So upon their arrival, Otto's wife, Stanislaw, was hired as a visiting assistant professor in mathematics and became the first woman mathematics professor at Kenyon. But her position was short-lived. She held the position for just 1 year, and documents in Kenyon's archives lead me to believe that her work at the college was restricted largely to supporting her husband. According to former student Edward Ordman, who went on to get a PhD in computer science, and he taught at University of Memphis, he explained that Otto Nikodym's English was limited when he first arrived in the United States. So in the early days at Kenyon, he prepared his lectures and lectured from this prepared text, while his wife accompanied him and fielded questions from students. After Nikodym's English improved, he taught solo. And Ordman then further explained that students learned that they got better responses when they phrased their questions in French or German, because Nikodym was fluent in both. But Stanislawa was an accomplished scholar in her own right. She was the first woman in Poland to earn a PhD in mathematics, a degree she received from the University of Warsaw the year after she married Otto. She presented her work at the International Congress of Mathematics in Bologna in 1928. She published papers solely in her research area of continuum theory, and she published several books, again as the sole author, and she co-authored papers with Otto, 2 of which were published while they were at Kenyon. She was also an artist, and I have two examples of her work here. On the left, you'll probably recognize this watercolor as Pierce Hall. And on the right, Stanislaw designed the mosaic that appears on Otto's tombstone, pictured here on the right, which can be found in a cemetery in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, just north of Philadelphia. I want to close with this photo of Nicodeme in his Gambier apartment. Seated to his right is his wife, Stanislaw, and to her right is William Transu holding a pipe. And then Dan Silverman is seated to the right of Transu, and he was a professor who was only in the department for 1 year. And then the guy on the far right, we don't know who that is. But I just think this picture is awesome, you know, with Otto working at the chalkboard, and they clearly have like tea and cookies or something to fuel their mathematics. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Christine Briner. And Christine was my first honor student nearly 3 decades ago. So this is kind of going to be fun to watch. I'm very excited to hear this.
Oh,
I'm going to stop sharing so that Christine can jump on.
Hi, it's lovely to be here. Let me share my screen. Hopefully everything works well. Okay. So 3 decades ago, goodness, I'm really happy to be here. I'm presuming that the audience is people who enjoy math, but might have forgotten their calculus. And I see there's a number of people who are recent graduates, so they probably didn't forget their calculus. So if you're bored at the beginning, I hope you're happy by the end. I'm a differential geometer. I actually came to it sort of very circuitous. I thought I would do something in algebra. I taught high school for 5 years before I decided to go to grad school in math, and then I somehow stumbled into differential geometry. So what I want to talk about today is a particular area in differential geometry, minimal surface theory, and talk about how we try to characterize them and what problems we try to solve. And Judy said about no more than 15 minutes for me. So I'll do no more than 15 minutes. So you have probably seen some examples of soap bubbles in the media, some sort of like nice pop math thing. So this is an example of a minimal surface, where a minimal surface, you could say one thing is that it's a soap film. It arises when you take a wire frame and you dip it in soapy water. So what you see here is the surface that has the least area for, let me just highlight the 2 boundary curves to make sure everyone can see. It's just this circle and this circle. That's the boundary. It's that this annulus is spanning. So this has the least area. And we'll see this come up later. This is a piece of a catenoid. And then here's another example of a minimal surface. This is half of what's called a helicoid. And so the boundary here is a bit funny. So it starts down here, it goes straight up through an axis, and then it winds around a helix this way. So what you see here is the soap film is sort of winding around. It's trying to achieve the least area, and actually doing that makes this very funky, fun surface. It's sort of half the shape of DNA. And it's half of a helicoid. We'll see the helicoid later. So, you know, this actually, I think this started in the late 1800s with a physicist from Belgium. Plateau was trying to understand soap films. And you could say, all right, you know, attempt 1 for what is a minimal surface is you could say, well, I'm going to call S a minimal surface if its area is the least area among all those surfaces that have the same boundary. And we could stop there. But we're not going to, or I'd be done, and I'd have talked for 2 minutes. So I just want to remind you, we in differential geometry, we like critical points of what we call variational problems. So here's an example, if you recall from calculus. I have this function, I think it's something like f of x equals x cubed times x minus, sorry, I'm having a hard time writing on my leg here, x minus 1 times x plus 1. And if you said, well, find the x value, so find the x value that gives me the minimum output, then you wouldn't have much fun because the minimum output is negative infinity and it's achieved at negative infinity. So you might say, okay, I want to look for local minima. You say, well, here, this looks like if I look at this X value and I look in a region nearby, I have a minimum there. That's great. But these points are also kind of interesting. So we like these points, and in calculus, of course, you like these points. These are other critical points. And I'll just say for the purposes of understanding what's coming later, if you're at this X value, then nearby, if you're in nearby X values, then this X value achieves the maximum for nearby X values. And if you're at this X value at X equals 0, it achieves the maximum if you move only to the left, and it achieves, sorry, a minimum if you're moving only to the left locally, and a maximum if you're moving only to the right. So in some sense, this point X equals 0 it's seeing itself as a minimum from this direction, but a maximum from this direction. And you find these by, of course, you take the derivative at X equals 0, or you take the derivative, set it equal to 0, and solve for X. So this is the idea. So when we move to multivariable critical points, you have sort of the points of interest here. I think there are about 5 points. And again, this graph is a graph of a function, some function f of x, y equals something. And this graph of this function is showing that in a neighborhood of whatever the x, y value is here, and here you have local maxima at least. And here you have sort of these local minimums. And here at this saddle, you're realized as a minimum if you moved only in this direction, and a maximum if you moved only in this direction. So again, these are just a reminder of what critical points are. And of course, recalling your calculus, you could say like I set the gradient equal to 0 and I solve for x and y to find these points. So I bring this up because I want to understand why we define minimal surfaces the way we do, and I'm going to try and make sense of that. So the area functional is going to help us define minimal surfaces. So it's a pretty straightforward object. You just take the set of any smooth surface with smooth boundary will restrict to R3. So a smooth surface with smooth boundary in R3, and this script A will be the function that the input is a surface and the output is a real number that gives you the area. So A of S is just going to be the area of S. So how can we define critical points for A? Well, when we were in this nice setting here, if we wanted to talk about critical points, we say, well, I start at some particular X and Y, and I look in a neighborhood of that X and Y, and I want to understand what's happening to the function in that neighborhood. I want to know what's happening to the outputs for nearby XY values. So the space of surfaces nearby a surface is rather large. And so we want to understand sort of how do you do these variations? How could we define these critical points? So I'm going to give you kind of a picture of this. I'm going to call this my surface S. And I'm going to think about how to vary the surface S. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take every point on the surface. Let's say this is a point P on the surface. And I'm going to assign to it a direction I want to move away from the surface. And I'm going to define a magnitude I want to move, an amount I want to move in that direction. So I'm going to start for any surface S, I'm going to start with a function whose input is a point on the surface and whose output is a real number. And I'm going to also need, that's going to give me in some part my magnitude. And I also need to know the normal vector. So the normal vector, I'll draw some pictures of the normal vector. The normal vector at this point is kind of, I picked a bad point. This one I can do sort of more exactly. This is my normal at this point. My normal here sort of is pointing in this direction. So you have your tangent planes and then you have your normal direction, which is obviously orthogonal. So once you define a normal, assuming your surface is orientable, so you can define the same normal direction on the whole surface there. At every point P, you're going to take your surface S and you're going to move it in its normal direction by the amount phi, sort of. Okay, so what we're actually going to do is we're going to take our point P. So S, I'm going to take S and I'm going to later call this T phi. S T phi is going to be the set of points that are going to look like this. Let me move it over somewhere else so I can draw the whole thing. So S T phi is going to be the set of points that look like this. You take a point P in your surface, you're going to move it by the amount phi in the direction of n, but you're going to slap a t in front, and I'll explain that momentarily. And so the idea is the following. We're going to take this surface S, and we're just going to wiggle it. We're trying to formalize wiggling it. We're going to wiggle the surface S. So we're wiggling it. We're taking every point in the surface. We're moving in the normal direction by this amount, t times phi. The normal is a unit. And this is, you know, if you like, I'm going to be completely precise for some of us. Now, what did I say in the initial problem? In the initial problem, I said we wanted to compare to surfaces that fix the boundary. And so not only should phi be a map from S to R, but I also want phi, when I restrict it to the boundary of S, is just equal to 0. So phi on the boundary of S is going to be 0. And also I need phi to be differentiable. Let's make it C3 or something. It has lots of nice derivatives so that I can define all of these surfaces and find the curving. Okay, so this is my ST phi. So I'm just going to wiggle the surface S, and I want to think about T as being very small, right? Because if you remember, when we were looking in these other situations, we were only looking in very small regions about the point. And so I want T to be very small, so I'm only looking very near S. Okay. And so this is the actual definition that I will be giving my differential geometry students tomorrow, actually, in class. This is perfectly timed. Is that this surface S, it's called a critical point for the area functional. If for every possible smooth phi that I can come up with that's 0 on the boundary, if I look at the area at all of those wigglings, and I compare it to the area at time t, I see that the derivative in t at t equals 0 is 0. So in this sense, it's a critical point for this area. It's a functional because it's mapping from surfaces to the reals. So it gives you a input as a surface and the output as a real number. So for every t phi, I get a different area, and then I calculate that. Now I have a function of t, and I can take its derivative in t. And so we call these critical points for the area functional. That's what we call minimal surfaces. Now, area minimizers obviously are among them, but there are lots more that don't minimize area. And if you want to know really what a differential geometer does, is we try to take something like this, which is, I think, completely unverifiable for a surface. I don't know how I would ever check if a surface was minimal using this definition. And we say, well, hopefully there's some geometric interpretation of this. And in fact, there is. And so if you wanted to say there's an equivalent definition, you can show that this is only true. This is true if and only if a particular curvature condition is satisfied on the surface. So if you know curvatures and you know the curvature of curves, really it's the normal curvature of a curve on the surface. The average of all of those should be 0. In a sense, this is not a minimal surface that I have a picture of, but just for convenience. But you should see something approximately like 2 curves, orthogonal curves at a point that have opposite orientations with respect to the normal direction and have equal curving. So just to point out that we would never be able to check this definition, but we have an equivalent definition. So what are some sample questions that we could ask? So what's the easiest example of a complete embedded minimal surface in R3? So when I say complete, I mean has no boundary. So this is a local thing. You just check on local patches. And embedded means it doesn't self-intersect. So what's the easiest example I can come up with? Hopefully, if I said anything that makes sense, it's a plane. Okay, so a plane, if you look at a plane and you fix some boundary inside the plane, and I look at this region inside, that actually is a minimizer for that boundary. So it's locally, for any variation that's 0 outside of this part, you see actually you're a minimizer, so definitely you're a critical point for area there. But then another kind of simple question is are there any minimal graphs? In other words, if I take my plane and I try and make a graph over the plane, are there any other things that I can get? Are there any minimal graphs that achieve this kind of local local area minimizer on sufficiently small scales or satisfies this critical point condition on any scale. And the answer to that is actually no. There's nothing else that's a graph except the planes. And this was proven in 1914, and actually only in the last 2 years, people proved this for planes inside of R4. So this is for planes inside of R3, and it's a much, much, much harder problem to talk about minimal surfaces when there are now two normal directions. So when there's a two-dimensional space of normal directions. Okay, so another natural question is, are there any minimal embeddings of a plane? And this is a more topological question. So what do I mean by that? I mean, take a plane and try and bend it and twist it and put it however you want without crossing over itself inside of R3, so that in every small enough neighborhood in the surface, it actually was an area minimizer in that component, or on every large scale, it was still a critical point. You could think about it either way, critical point for area. So are there any minimal embeddings of the plane? Obviously, there's no graphs, so it can't be a graph. I should say a non-planar minimal embedding. So here's an example. It was found in the 1700s. So this is the full, this is the much more full picture of the helicoid that shows two sides of the helicoid. So this you get by lifting and rotating your pencil at constant speed. You might ask, how many of these are there? And actually, so in the late 1700s, they were found, and in the early 2000s, it was shown that these are the only ones that you can get that are minimal, that don't self-intersect, and have the topology of a plane. And of course, you could take this helicoid, you can scale it up and down, and it's still a minimal surface, but they can only be this, nothing else. And I'll just finish with this slide with some other sample questions. So you could say, if I start with a nice curve in R3, does it always bound an area minimizer? And that actually got Jesse Douglas the Fields Medal, the first Fields Medal, and Douglas Ratto had another solution to that, plateau solutions. And then if the surface exists, is it smooth? So what mathematical process did you find or did you use to find that minimizer? And if you did in the process, did you end up with actually something that was a surface or had some sort of was kind of singular in some sense? That question's been answered in the 70s. If the surface exists, it's unique. Is it unique? And the answer to that is no. You can have all sorts of curves that have different minimizers. They have the same area, but they're different surfaces. And then how would you find a critical point for the area functional that's not a minimizer? This is a huge industry, especially these days. It's been used to solve a large number of problems. If you can find non-minimizing critical points that do sort of particular things that you'd like them to do. And then the last thing is, if you start with a topological assumption, can you find a minimal surface with that assumption, like the embedding of a plane? And then how many of those might exist? So I'm going to put this will just be the last slide to show you, because I think this is sort of interesting. It's coming back. We've seen our two soap bubbles. So the other one, this is 1760, even before the helicoid. It's a catenoid. You take a catenary and you just rotate it around the axis. And there were 3 different characterizations of the catenoid in different time periods. You can sort of even see in 1860 was characterized as the only minimal surface of revolution. In 1983, you have finite total curvature, which you have to define, and 2 embedded ends, which you've removed a lot of the restrictions you had before. And then, this is another characterization, non-flat, complete embedded minimal surface, and no genus. So there's different ways you could try and characterize these things. And my time is up. So thank you.
Okay, I think Alton Barbahan's up, right?
Yes, hi. Can everybody see my screen or my slides?
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Judy. So my name is Alton Barbahan. I'm a data scientist at UCSF, working with Sugi Lee in the Division of HIV, Infectious Disease, and Global Medicine. So I was told to that there'd be a very mixed audience. So I was hoping to do kind of tell a story, right? So I'm probably going to spend about half my time actually just talking about HIV and how it works. And then some time describing non-parametric regression modeling, which is probably my favorite statistical discipline and one that I first was introduced to by Brad Hartlaub at Kenyon. Yeah, and then sort of tie it all together. So just due to the public nature of this, I feel like I should say that I'm a statistician, and please talk to your doctor or licensed medical professional. Yeah, I know some biology, but it's all very informal. All right, so HIV. So I'm assuming everybody on this call knows about HIV, right? HIV is a virus. It infects CD4 T cells. So these are the T cells that are useful for having memory, right? So they help, if you see a disease, you develop CD4 T cell, you develop these T cells, and they help you fight it the next time you see the disease. In particular, viruses all basically use the host or human sort of body and its cells to make more of the virus. The way HIV does that is it actually puts a copy of itself in the host cell's DNA. So that means that when the host cell goes to transcribe its DNA into proteins, it sometimes makes new HIV cell particles that can then go on to infect new cells. And that's sort of its main method of spreading throughout the human body. All right, so you get, say, one virus infects one cell, that cell makes 10 other viruses, they go infect 10 other cells, and it kind of proliferates exponentially. At a certain point, your body starts fighting it. Yeah, cool. So the main way HIV proliferates is through this viral replication mechanism that I just told you about. But because it does infect T cells, memory T cells, there's two other methods that are very important, right? So the first is these are memory cells. And unlike a lot of other cells in the body, they are incredibly long-lived. They're kind of made to sit there quietly, waiting for you to get the infection again, sort of at the ready. And so they're very long-lived. And they can also, of course, like other cells, proliferate just clonally, right? So one cell divides, makes two copies of itself. Because the HIV puts itself in the host cell's DNA, both of the cells then that it just made now have the capability to produce HIV. Right, so fortunately, we have modern antiretroviral therapy. What this does is it blocks cells from getting infected, but it doesn't kill cells that are infected, right? It just means that new cells cannot become infected. So any cell that is already infected is just going to hang out, live there, very long-lived, can divide clonally. Yeah, right. So we have this component here, right? So these cells don't get killed by antiretrovirals, and they hang out for a while. So why do we care? Right, so larger HIV reservoirs, which is what we're going to refer to these cells as, are associated with increased immune reaction, right? So these cells can at some point wake up, start spitting out HIV, and your body gets scared and attacks it, which is good. But it's a very constant stress because these cells can be waking up at any point. And partly due to that, it also is associated with greater risk of adverse events such as heart attacks and strokes, right? So we can have people that are living very healthy lives, but we still want them to have very small reservoirs. As I kind of just said, these cells can always wake up, right? So even if you take your antiretrovirals and let your body get rid of all of the virus in your body that's floating around, if you stopped taking your antiretrovirals, and just one of these cells starts making HIV virus again, you can get reinfected. And so we have no persistent drug-free, or we have no drug-free remission in HIV. And finally, we don't have a good way to target these except for the immune system. And so what we're going to be talking about today is how we can get rid of some of this reservoir. Our sort of clinical hypothesis is that earlier ART initiation, so if you start this antiretroviral therapy soon after acquiring HIV, you're going to be able to fight it off better, basically, right? So you're going to start with lower levels of HIV, and your immune system is going to be a lot more ready, healthy, non-exhausted. And so it can get in there and fight the HIV more effectively. And so the combination of a very active and healthy immune system plus the antiretrovirals will do well. So what we did is we designed this study where people who were diagnosed with HIV within 100 days were referred to our clinic or to our group. And then we gave them antiretroviral therapies and followed them for about 6 months. We continued following for over a year afterwards, but the data is just more sparse. And we have basically from a vial of blood, we can measure how many cells have HIV in them. And so that's what we're going to model. So as any good data visualization or data project starts with, you look at the data. What do we have, right? So each of these gray curves is the decay of a specific person, right? So at each time point, we have the amount of HIV DNA that we find, right? This is a sort of a measure of the reservoir size. Because we have 60 people, it's a little easier just to highlight a couple. I should also note that we're all looking at this on the log scale. Yeah, there's a wide range of reservoir sizes, and so that will be very useful. So our model is going to look something like this, right? So we want to quantify, the thing we're measuring is the reservoir size for a person at a specific time. We know each person starts with a different reservoir size. And we think that we're going to assume that all the reservoirs decay at a certain fixed rate. And then, of course, there's some measurement error that we need to take into account. Here, I'm not going to go too far into it, but technically we're doing a mixed effect regression model because we're going to assume that these unique starting positions are all sort of random, and we'll sort of integrate them out because we really care about estimating just this decay rate. Yeah. So from here, we need to quantify the decay rate, right? So we just started with the model of the reservoir size, but what we care about is the rate of change. And so if we looked at the average reservoir size at a given time, what we get is this kind of linear model whose derivative is this constant, which is great, right? This is basically the rate of change in reservoir size, which is a decay rate. If we wanted to, we could easily convert this into a half-life because of the log2 scale, right? Half-life is a measure of time it takes for a reservoir to decrease by a factor of 2, or just an exponential decay thing, right? So you can think of this as like radioactive isotope decaying by a factor of 2. In this case, because we're on the log2 scale, it's very closely related to B. So we take this linear model, we throw our data into it, and we need to see how well it does, right? So one of the very classic ways to do this is to compare the observed to the expected estimates, right? So the observed estimates are the real YIs that we measured, and the estimated reservoir size is the AI plus BT, right? The thing the model predicts. So if points are above this black dotted line, they are underestimated because the observed value is bigger than the estimated value. And if they're to the right of the observed, they're overestimated. And looking at this plot, it might look like the data does pretty well. Interestingly, if we highlight the same 3 people from before, what we can see is that it systematically is overestimating the larger reservoir sizes for each person. And so this trick that we've done to hide the first sort of the individual level offsets is maybe, well, obviously it's doing reasonably well, but it's important to look at the interpersonal behavior, the behavior within a patient. Right, so as George Box once said, basically, all models are wrong, right? So this is where we get into the non-parametric regression. So basically, we've assumed this linear model below, but it might look something totally different, right? It may just be this wiggly function f that we're sort of guessing looks kind of like this linear model. And can we do any better? So Taylor series comes to the rescue, in my opinion, right? So here, hopefully this is sort of a review for everybody, but basically we can approximate this function f, as long as f is a nice function for those who care, I guess, analytic. Right, so our function f can be expressed in terms of its derivatives. And what this looks like is basically a linear model in the polynomial terms, right? So here I filled in a as times 0. Right, so what we can do is basically we can keep adding polynomial terms, right? So we had this first couple, but basically what this is telling us is we can get a better approximation of our function if we use a higher degree polynomial as the estimate. I stole this graphic from Wikipedia. I think it's pretty cool, right? There's two things to notice as we do a better higher degree polynomials in the Taylor series. The first is it fits the data better, or it provides a better approximation over a larger interval when there are higher degrees. And unfortunately, the higher degree polynomials tend to infinity very quickly if the model is actually not polynomial. That sort of breaks things. So ideally, we want something that has the fit of a medium degree polynomial, but with the sort of support of a wider degree polynomial. Right? So one approach to doing that is piecewise polynomials, which are known as splines commonly. So here we have a blue curve, hypothetical curve, and we're estimating it with 3 piecewise constant functions, right? So between less than c1, between the two knots, c1 and c2, and greater than c1, 2, we're fitting it with piecewise as a constant, which is a degree 0 polynomial. The next kind of logical thing to do is a piecewise linear model. This fits a linear model between each of the knots. And as we can see, it starts to approximate the blue line a little bit better. But the blue line's continuous. The green lines aren't. So we can do things like impart structural constraints, such as continuity, right? When we do that, we end up going from 6 parameters to 4 parameters, which makes the model smoother, making the model smoother and reducing the degrees of freedom, which will help our estimation power. Yeah, so this little parenthetical plus sign thing is a very helpful function, right? Basically, it's just the max of the difference, right? And this lets us basically say we have a linear model, and then we're going to adjust the slope after c1, and then we're going to adjust the slope after c2. Sorry, this is should be c2. For the sake of going into polynomial models, right? We frequently do cubic splines, right? So if you fit a cubic on each of these data, it's kind of nonsensical. We can make the 0th derivative continuous. We can make the 1st derivative continuous. Maybe get the 3rd derivative continuous. And it basically looks like the linear model. If we made the 3rd derivative continuous, it would just be a single cubic function. So yeah, so now that we kind of know non-parametric modeling at a very high level, and we understand the biology, and we have like 2 minutes, I'm going to quickly put these things together to show you how we can do the modeling to answer our questions about the rate of decay and the effect of early ART initiation, and answer some counterfactual, or do some counterfactual estimation that might be useful clinically. All right, so we're going to take our linear model and expand it into a piecewise linear model. This is going to let us have different slopes at different points in time. Since the slope is basically related to the decay rate and the half-life, this will make our generalization pretty easy and natural. We're also going to add in some interaction terms with the delay in ART initiation. And this is going to let us get the actual how much, and this will let us assess how much the timing of an ART initiation affects the performance of the model. Again, taking the derivative basically shows you that this delay in ART initiation is very useful. Gives you the change in slope. Yeah. Right. So we have our full model, we have our derivative estimates. So what happens when we do this? So we had our observed people, and what we can see is that when you add some flexibility to the model, we are no longer overestimating as much on the upper end of each person's range. For reasons that I can get into if we want in the discussion, in the breakout room, we ended up modeling just with 2 phases, between week 0 and week 5, and week 5 and 24. We estimated the half-lives, right? And so what we can see is that basically there's a very rapid decay for the first month, and then it continues at a much slower rate. We can also estimate the change in decay during each phase for a week delayed in ART initiation. And importantly, what we can see is that because of this one, right? So for every week we wait, right? So if you show up, you test positive and you decide, and you start treatment today, versus testing positive and then starting treatment next week, that actually changes your slope, the slope of the decay model, pretty significantly for most of the decay, right? So that's where we're going to get our benefit for having a earlier ART initiation, causing smaller or leading to smaller viral reservoirs. We can also look at sort of the average treatment effect of delaying for a week, right? So at week 8, what is the reservoir size change if we had delayed a week? All right, and what we can see basically is that the delay, the effect of delaying compounds, right? So as we wait, there's not much of an effect in the first 8 weeks, but going out to a year, there's a pretty meaningful effect. Yeah, right. So to put this concretely, if you wait an extra 4 months or 4 weeks, which is a month, you'd have about twice the reservoir size, right? Full log 2 change at 1 year on ART. And of course, you should extrapolate with extreme care. We do have data out past 24 weeks. We did validate the model there. It's just less dense. So yeah, so I've showed you about I've sort of walked you through this process of taking these biological insights and marrying them with the modeling questions and making sure the model can actually answer the questions that we have. And then additionally, there's a trade-off between model fit and interpretability, right? So for instance, we could have gone for cubic splines, but we wouldn't have had as much ability to do half-life estimates, for instance. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of people that were involved with this project and funding agencies, but most importantly, our participants. Yeah, I'm way over. Thank you.
Thank you, Alton. Okay, yeah, thank you. So third up is Katarina Tang, right? Currently a graduate student at Cornell in applied mathematics.
Yes. Thanks, Judy. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. And cool. Does that look right to everyone? Okay, awesome. Yeah, so like Judy mentioned, I'm in applied math here at Cornell. I'm in my 4th year, the beginning of my 4th year. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about this first project that I've spent about a year on at this point. It's very, very tied to the application, but I'm hoping to kind of talk about how it's motivated research questions that I would like to tackle in the next few years of my PhD. So we're talking about the power grid, and like Alton, I'm going to give a little bit of background. Across the country, I'm going to focus here in New York, but across the country, there's a lot of initiatives to move power grids to zero carbon emissions. Here in New York, we have a very ambitious plan to get to a zero carbon power grid by 2050, mostly via the integration of renewable energy and also increasing electrification of various sectors, such as the heating sector and the transportation sector. And through doing this, you end up coupling the energy supply and demand much more tightly with the weather and the climate. So for example, when it's hot out, this is a little bit counterintuitive, but when it's very hot and sunny out, solar panel efficiency actually decreases, and same with transmission line capacity, it's decreased. So you have less renewable energy generation, it's harder to transmit it across your grid. And at the same time, energy demand really spikes because you have a lot of need for cooling. And so this is an example of these compound energy system stress events that we really care about, making sure that our grid is hardened to. However, the power grid is very complex and interconnected. The way that power gets rerouted through the grid is very hard to understand sometimes. And so disentangling these pressure points that influence system reliability can be challenging because these pressure points might be spatially and temporally disconnected from where load shedding, which is power outages, where that actually occurs. So a very standard network theory approach to this question, I think, would be to take your network and consider some kind of shock to the system at one node, possibly multiple nodes. And you can see how that shock kind of propagates through the system. And you might quantify like how critical a piece of infrastructure is by the size of the cascade that it causes. But this isn't quite the right point of view for the question that we're interested in asking, because we want to consider not the total failure of some nodes, but a kind of general weakening that might compound and lead to bigger power outages, or sorry, bigger issues like power outages downstream. So this is really a question about network inference. Can we take data about the performance of the New York grid? So here I'm using simulation data, but there's nothing that would stop you from using real world data if you had access to it. So for example, how much power is flowing through one line, generation of a hydro generator, and also load shedding downstream. Can we take this data and infer some kind of underlying connections between the transmission lines, the generators, the batteries, et cetera, and load shedding? And this is what I'm referring to as a pressure point, are these pieces of infrastructure that are kind of key in determining system reliability. And so a common tool for this kind of directed network inference is transfer entropy. This is actually very common in computational neuroscience. It's a non-parametric statistic that people use to infer connections between different regions of our brain. And so there's kind of a philosophical question that I'm asking within this project, which is transfer entropy even the right tool for identifying these potential pressure points? So I'll briefly talk about transfer entropy in very loose terms. So it formalizes this very specific definition of causality that's not quite what I think how we would understand the word causality if we were just talking colloquially, but it's this idea of observational causality, which states that a random process X will cause another process Y if knowing the history of X helps us predict the future of Y over and above what is predictable from the past of Y alone. And so transfer entropy takes this and puts this into information theoretic terms. This is looking at a conditional mutual information. So how much uncertainty about the future of Y here is reduced if we know the past of X, given that we already know the past of Y, conditioned on the past of Y. And so you can think of this as helping to answer the question, if we're interested in predicting load shedding at some important bus, for example, in New York City, where we really don't want to see power outages, and we can observe just one other piece of infrastructure in our grid to help us predict load shedding, what piece of infrastructure would we want to observe? And so for the sake of time, I'm going to sweep all of the like juicy mathematical details under the rug, but that's what's taken up most of this year. But I wanted to show that this does work. I think that this is gives some valuable insight. So for example, here is in these 2 time series, I've colored red all of the hours in which you see load shedding at this starred bus downstate. And I'm plotting 2 time series that represent the utilization of 2 different transmission lines. So if the utilization is 1, that means that we're pushing like maximum power through that line, and that line can't transmit any more power. So branch 8 is actually the transmission line that goes directly into this bus. So it's kind of unsurprising that when that transmission line is congested, when transmission is at, or the utilization is at 1, that kind of precedes load shedding at this bus. But the relationship between this bus and branch 91, which is down here, is a little bit less obvious. But we do see that when there is high utilization, so not even congestion, right? Like this bus isn't, or sorry, this branch isn't at capacity, but there is kind of a relationship here. And I'm happy to talk about kind of diving into this, like why this actually does make sense. But this is something that you wouldn't necessarily pick up on using kind of standard power systems analysis tools. If I think since this is a mathy audience, I expect that some of you picked up on kind of a big flaw to this pairwise approach that I've been proposing for network inference using transfer entropy, which is if you have a situation like this, right, where some process X causes some process Y or influences some process Y, sorry, Z, and then Z in turn influences some process Y. If we look at the transfer entropy from X to Y, we expect that that's going to be non-zero, which would imply that there is some kind of a connection here. And to account for this, the fact that Z is mediating the connection here, we need to look at a conditional transfer entropy. So this is saying what's the reduction in uncertainty about the future of Y if we're given the history of X, given that we already know the history of now Y and Z. And so this conditioning helps us tease out, like, does this connection here from X to Y really exist? Of course, this is all well and good for, this very small little toy network. But if you wanted to apply this to a power grid or many other real world networks, there's a combinatorial explosion in the number of tests that you would have to do to account for these complex chains of interactions, right? Like pairwise, it's n choose 2 if you have n nodes in your network. But then if you're considering chains of 3, that's n choose 3, and it goes on and on. And so this challenge has really motivated an interest in hypergraph reconstruction. So hypergraphs are like pairwise networks, but we allow interactions between 3 nodes, 4 nodes, etc. And so kind of in very general terms, I'm going to kind of wave my hands here because this is things I'm interested in. I would say they're like quarter-baked ideas right now. But in general, you can assume you have n nonlinear systems nodes coupled via a hypergraph. So each node's dynamics are governed by some kind of intrinsic dynamics, but then you also have contributions from pairwise interactions, triadic interactions, so on and so forth. So this little coefficient A with the superscript 2, that's like your adjacency matrix. When you have the superscript 3, now you're talking about adjacency tensors and so on. And so you can, I guess, for my purposes, I'm assuming that I'm like handed time series data from these n nodes, right? And there's kind of 2 questions that I'm really interested in. The first is the question of identifiability. So how can you decide actually if there is evidence for higher order interactions in your data? If there's noise, you don't want to overfit to that noise. So the question of identifiability is very important. And then secondly, like I mentioned, this kind of idea of the combinatorial explosion in terms of the number of possible interactions you need to consider. Is there a stepwise approach where we can iteratively search the space of possible interactions? With the power grid, you have kind of a physical wiring structure. Is there something that we can leverage there to help whittle down the spaces of like possible interactions? Yeah, so this is kind of what I'm starting to think about now that my power grids project is wrapping up a little bit. and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. I think I could probably speak on behalf of the faculty that it's been a pleasure to just see what, former students of us are now doing all this interesting work in these different areas of mathematics and life, right? Helping to solve complex problems in the real world. So, or complex problems in the mathematical world, right? So now at this point, there should be some breakouts that are going to open up. And if people want to go to individual breakouts, I think Colette is putting those together. You should see something somewhere